So how novel was Darwin's idea of natural selection? The idea that species had evolved or changed over time and given rise to new species was a very old one, going back to classical Greece. Anaximander, around 550 BC, and later Hippocrates, Empedocles, and indeed Aristotle. So in particular, there was an idea that characteristics acquired during the lifetime of an organism could be passed on to offspring, so-called soft inheritance. So, for example, if you did lots of weightlifting and built up muscle mass, you could pass that acquired character on to your children. Or if the ancestors of giraffes strained their necks up to reach higher leaves, they could pass this incrementally longer neck on to their offspring. And that's how people thought about evolution, if they did, for 2,000 years or more. From 1800 onwards, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck put the classical idea of soft inheritance together with the idea that there is some sort of driving force within organisms that tends to make them more complex, a complexification force. For the first 60 years of the 19th century, this blend of ideas, Lamarckism, was the predominant view. And this is the background against which Darwin formulated his ideas of natural selection. In natural selection, the key difference from everything that came before was the notion that heritable characteristics of individuals within a species vary, and that this variation determines the number of offspring that individuals are likely to have. This can either be because they have characters that make them better at obtaining resources from the environment, or because they're more attractive to potential mates, or frequently both. With limited food, habitat, and breeding opportunities, therefore, individuals within species are in competition, ultimately to leave more offspring like themselves. It's striking that the voyage of the Beagle, on which Darwin made many of his observations, ended in 1836, a full 23 years before he published On the Origin of Species and put forward the ideas of natural selection. It seems that Darwin took a great deal of time to weigh the evidence and was cautious about how his ideas might be perceived, trying them out on friends and colleagues, not all of whom were entirely positive. Now, in that 23 years, another much younger naturalist, Alfred Russel Wallace, inspired at least in part by reading Darwin's own 1839 account of his Beagle explorations, travelled himself around South America and the East Indies, and essentially came up with exactly the same idea as Darwin. Now, Wallace placed a bit more emphasis on the importance of different physical environments and biogeography in his version of natural selection and speciation, while Darwin placed his emphasis a little more on competition between individuals. So Alfred Russel Wallace was just ready to publish the Wallace theory of natural selection. But first, he wrote to Darwin to see what he thought of it. Now, Darwin was completely devastated, and he wrote to Lyell on the 18th of June in 1858 and said, "I never saw a more striking coincidence. So all of my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed." Now, fortunately, Wallace was a Victorian gentleman in the best possible sense and agreed to publish a paper together with Darwin, which was read at the Linnean Society in London on the 1st of July in 1858. Had it not been for Wallace's generosity, Darwin would be a great less widely known than he is. Now, there was a vital missing piece, however, and that was the mechanism by which characteristics were passed down to offspring. Later on, in 1868, Darwin speculated about a mechanism called pangenesis. The idea was that every cell type in the body continually produced tiny organic particles called gemmules, and that these gemmules migrated to the gonads and were incorporated into the sperm and egg. Now, this is a reworking of an ancient Greek idea from Hippocrates, and it's Lamarckian in the sense that changes to an organism through its lifetime would affect the gemmules produced. Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, did various experiments that failed to demonstrate the presence of gemmules in the blood, although Darwin disputed that one would expect to find them there. Nonetheless, Galton's experiments were a bit of a blow to the credibility of Darwin's ideas, and Darwin started to fall very slightly out of favour as a consequence. But there were two things that served to rehabilitate Darwin and produce what we now know as the modern synthesis, or neo-Darwinism. The first was the work in 1892 of August Weismann. Weismann's key idea was that inheritance occurred exclusively through the gametes in multicellular organisms, the eggs and sperm, and that these were quite distinct from the somatic cells of the rest of the body. He also did experiments to see if changes to the somatic cells could be passed on, and they very clearly couldn't. So the attributes of an individual seemed to be set at conception with the fusion of an egg and sperm. The second thing that helped to rescue Darwin was the rediscovery around 1900 of the work from 1866 of Gregor Mendel. Darwin believed that attributes were inherited by blending of the features of both parents. One of the things that Mendel experimented with was 2 lines of pea plants. One line always produced dark pink flowers when you bred them with one another, and the other line always produced white flowers. So if you cross these dark pink and white lines, blending inheritance suggests that you might expect to get plants that are all somewhere in between, with light pink flowers. But what you actually see is that all of the offspring are dark pink. Not only that, but if you cross that first generation, the F1 with itself, you get 3/4 dark pink flowers and 1/4 white. You never see light pink flowers. Now, this makes absolutely no sense whatsoever if inheritance is by blending, but it does make sense if there are discrete factors, as Mendel called them, one from each parent, and if the factor for dark pink overrides the effects of or dominates over the factor for white. Now, today we call Mendel's factors genes, and it's very unfortunate that Darwin never read his work. There's a footnote to this story. We now know that certain acquired attributes can be inherited not via the genes, but via, for example, modifications of the histone proteins onto which DNA is packaged, and via methylation of the DNA. Now, these are mechanisms that don't change the DNA, but they change the way in which genes are expressed in response to changes in the environment of an individual during its lifetime. And they can also be inherited, although these effects may only last 2 or 3 generations. So it was the combination of Darwinism, together with the work of Gregor Mendel and Albert Weismann, among others, that yielded what we now call the modern synthesis of evolutionary biology, or neo-Darwinism.